Thanks, Elliot. So this next session is one that I've been really looking forward to, and I think we have a number of interesting topics to cover. Before I get started, just very quickly, left to right, we have here former Governor Lingle of Hawaii, to my far right, to your left. Next to her is Mike Jackson, who is the Director of Research with the Fuel Freedom Foundation. And then Dirk, who's the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Transport, Building, and Urban Development in Germany. Thank you for coming. And then finally, immediately to my right, here we have Dankner, who's the Chairman of the Board of Directors and shareholder of Door Chemicals. So I guess where I'd want to just, is by way of introduction, I think I love how this conference is set up, and we're really working towards the idea of choices and the concept that we want to get to a situation where consumers have choices about all the interesting types of fuel options that are out there. But of course, there's an interim step that has to take place, which is there have to be some important choices that first need to be made by policymakers, because the consumer who walks up to the pump can't simply wish that they're going to have LNG show up there and be able to put it in their car, or wish that they can buy electricity at the gas station. There needs to be change that takes place. And between now and then, there needs to be some kind of regulatory change along the way. So those are the kinds of issues I thought we're going to delve a little more deeply into here today. But before we get started, I do want to give each of the panelists a moment to sort of talk a little bit about their perspective on where they're coming on this. So Governor Lingle, as former governor of the state of Hawaii, which if I had to pick a U.S. state, strikes me more like the state of Israel than maybe any other state, in that it is literally an island, whereas Israel, of course, is sort of more politically an island. Tell us a little bit about some of the efforts that you undertook when you were governor, and also your thoughts looking ahead about the kinds of policies that we need to try and proliferate choice for consumers.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here with everyone. I wanted to start with your question, which is what can policymakers do, what should they do? Hawaii is an outlier when it comes to electricity because, as you know, and you've heard today, in the United States, only 1% of the electricity is created by generating oil. In Hawaii, it's closer to 90%. So we are very unusual, and that's what got me involved with the issue of different sources of energy. But today, as I look at a national and international approach, I think your question about what should policymakers do, there are two things. One is to create this open fuel standard that has already been discussed earlier. And the reason is so clear, and that is unless vehicles are able to take any kind of fuel, a market will not be created. People won't go out and produce a variety of fuels because cars can't use it. It's just that simple. So government clearly has a role to play. They can do it in a way that doesn't cost the government any money whatsoever. Nothing new has to be invented. They just have to mandate that cars be capable of taking any kind of fuel. The government shouldn't and doesn't have to choose winners and losers in what kind of fuel, just make the vehicle capable of taking all kinds of fuels. Secondly, in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency would need to change a couple of their administrative rules that's holding back the use of renewables. But in order to succeed in this area, it has to be an international coalition, in my opinion. China, obviously the largest producer of methanol today, Brazil and America, largest producers of ethanol. This means if they can come together, and as was stated earlier, with Israel because of the innovation capability that they have, even as a beginning of countries coming together, because every nation has a stake in this issue, because every nation is reliant on oil for transportation, which means every nation is sending, in our case, billions of dollars out of their own country to go somewhere else. It's not benefiting their people and their country. So all of us will benefit. Every nation will benefit if we can create a market of alternative fuels, because that will bring prices down of gasoline, will keep the money in your own country. So I think that's a big plus. Remember, any nation, their number one responsibility, their number one obligation is the national security of their country. And if your economy is devastated because of the price of energy for transportation or the unreliability of access to that energy, it's going to disrupt your economy, which is going to lead to instability, and it's going to threaten your national security.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I have a few questions I'll come back to you on and give everybody a chance here. Mike, tell me a little bit about your organization and some of the efforts that you've undertaken in the U.S.
Sure. The Fuel Freedom Organization was founded in 2011 by two Israelis, Yossi Hollander and A.L. Ardenoff. And the goal really is to, and the mission is to get competition at the fuel pump. So figure out ways of getting cheaper fuels that would be able to compete against gasoline. And there's two sort of major things that are happening on the fuel side and on the vehicle side. If you think about this, on the fuel side, at least in the U.S. with the shale plays, there's a good chance that you have now decoupled the natural gas and oil prices to be able to now take the natural gas resources and bring them into a liquid fuel that might be able to compete into the gasoline sector. On the vehicle side, the vehicles have gotten, how do I say it? They've gotten smart, right? I mean, you now have basically computerized vehicles that can detect the amount of oxygen that's in the fuel, whether it's an FFV or not. Now, there are in the U.S. at this point, there's some 14 million FFVs. So there's an existing market that could use fuels that are derived from natural gas, such as methanol or ethanol. We believe that there are a number of other vehicle classes, such as the FFV, what we call FFV twins, i.e. have the same engine family as the FFV, but haven't been sold as an FFV, could also maybe be expanded into it. So if you start focusing on the existing fleet, which then would develop the market for the fuel, you might have a good chance of getting competition, developing the business case to get the fuels into the marketplace. And once you do that, you've enabled higher octane fuels that could be used in the newer vehicles, design of the newer vehicles. So the whole point is, let's have competition at the fuel pump. In my 40 years experience with alternative fuels, the biggest problem has been there's really not been a consumer proposition, a value proposition for the consumer. The consumer believes that air quality is important. The consumer believes that it's important to reduce petroleum, but very few are willing to actually pay for those benefits. Those benefits generally have come from incentive programs that the governments have put in place. And those are great in terms of buying down the first cost of the vehicle or subsidizing the fuel a little bit, but that's not a sustainable business case. And the whole idea of fuel freedom is to move to a sustainable business case based on the economics and based on the technology of the cars. So fuel freedom is focusing on research to prove out the vehicle capabilities, to prove out the material capabilities of these vehicles, as well as to enable business to take a good hard look at the business case.
Great. And Dirk, in Germany, interesting, different, I always think, from the U.S. perspective, we talk a great deal about energy security in terms of energy reform. I feel like much of the rhetoric and the sort of, and really the actual rationale behind policy making in terms of the transport sector in Germany is often geared towards climate. So if you would tell us a little bit more about how that's playing out and the kinds of regulations that you've sought to put into effect to try and change your transportation system.
Well, thank you, Ethan. Thank you for hosting the conference. Well, I think we have to keep three things in mind. The one is, what technology options do we have on the vehicle side? And I'm not talking only about passenger cars, but also about other transport modes like buses, trucks, and so on. The second, where we have heard a lot about, is the fuels, the different fuels and alternative fuels we have for the transport sector. And the third point I think we have also to take care of is, what are the infrastructures which are needed for all the alternative fuels, and who has to pay for that? That is important. You can have many choices on a technical level, on the fuel level, but who pays for the necessary infrastructure to use all these alternatives? And then the question is, what will policy do? And in Germany, we come very strongly from the energy side of energy policy. As you know, 2 years ago, the government decided that we want to change our energy system, that we want to step off atomic energy, and all the sectors now have to contribute to that. That means also the transport sector has to fulfill the role. And then the game changer as far as I can observe, is that we bring together two systems which are not very close together in history. The one is the system of electrical energy, and the other one is the transport sector, which is in Germany, as in most other countries, highly dependent on fossil fuels and oil. And what we are doing now is bringing these two sectors together. So we are talking about bringing electrical energy to the transport sector. And that means that we have to take care what does that combination mean. And then we are not only talking about electric cars and battery cars and plug-ins and fuel cell cars. We are talking about bringing two systems together which did not work together for decades.
That strikes me as enormously challenging. I mean, it's not just complicated enough to reform the transport sector. You're trying to harmonize it with the power sector at the same time that you're getting rid of all your atomic generation. That sounds rather tricky to me. But we'll come back to that. Maybe you'll solve that in the next question. And finally, I did want to ask Gil specifically about Israel and your role in it as a non-policy person, but someone who's in industry. And obviously, I guess if you would tell us a little bit about your interest in methanol, and what's the kind of regulatory regime that you'd like to see in order for that opportunity to be fulfilled for your company?
Well, as industry, we are involved in methanol for over 50 years as a chemical. And recently, a few years ago, there has been the Clean Air Act with regards to industry. And for us, it was natural to replace our heavy fuel in steam boilers with methanol. And actually, it was quite a challenge because we had to go into technicalities which we were not familiar with. But that led us to another challenge, and that was to convert power generations from fuel to methanol. And we've done that because we really didn't want to do anything with the automobile industry because of regulation. We were rather scared of it, and as a private sector, we didn't really see our role in that game. But that's where the Israeli government came into the game. And normally, we are not used that the government is the initiator of new ideas. I mean, normally it's the private sector, it's the consumers that create a certain demand, and the politicians without politicians follow the consumers. And here we have a very interesting situation where the Israeli government has taken a decision, and quite an amazing one, to change the world, as Eyal said earlier. And then that allowed us to take part in this new policy. And we are actually conducting two tests. One is with M15, blending 15% methanol in gasoline. With ordinary cars, we are using Volkswagen, Toyota, and Skoda, which are widely used in Israel. And it's been running for 2 years very successfully.
So these are non-flex fuel vehicles?
Ordinary vehicles, and the test is conducted in a very thorough manner where the government, different government agencies, they actually dictate the parameters, whether it's the Minister of Environment who wants to see emissions improved, then Minister of Energy and Transportation, etc. And this experiment so far has been rather successful, and we really don't see any difficulties. And recently we started an M70 with flexible fuel vehicles. It's GM cars, and I cannot comment yet about it because it's quite new. But practically speaking, it's quite obvious that the M15 can be utilized in the market quite easily into the marketplace and to the benefit of the consumers.
So I hear this argument in favor of methanol, which is that it's something akin to a drop-in fuel, that you can put it in an existing structure. And whereas these other types of fuels, you'd have to build you'd have to build different types of fueling infrastructure or change tanks, things like that. But let me just mention that I have a fueling infrastructure in my garage right now. It's called an electrical socket. And I can go in and I can plug my car in there right now. And it just strikes me that, and I welcome your comments on this, Gil, which is that Israel's been blessed with this incredible bounty of natural gas. And if that is used in the correct way to really lower electricity prices, and if the price of electric vehicles come down, which we at Bloomberg New Energy Finance think they will, isn't that a better option than methanol in terms of for the consumer? I mean, it's even simpler potentially than the methanol option.
I think the way we should go about it is to offer as many options as possible and let the consumers choose, because mind you, there are over 2 billion consumers worldwide. So in your case, electric car might be your choice, and in China nowadays there are I think over 100 million scooters, which I remember when first going to China, they were bicycles, then they were based on fuel, now they are electrical. When you play golf, you might use electric car. On the other hand, I would rather use a methanol blend, and so let's allow the consumers to choose. And if we do so, the quality and the price will be improved one way or another.
Sure.
Ethan, if I could follow up on that point, you may have a home, a single-family home, so it's easy for you to plug in. But if you live in Hawaii, you have a large number of apartments, condominiums, and in Tel Aviv, it's probably similar, many cities. But one thing government can do, and we did in Hawaii, we made it mandatory that you could not prohibit in an apartment building from someone installing an electrical outlet. I drive a Leaf car.
That's what we're about to lease. As well.
It's a great car. I live in a condominium, so I had to get approval for where it was put. I had to have an electrical contractor put it in. I had to have an electrical permit from the city, but they could not prohibit me from putting in that electric charge, and that's really very important, because a condominium by nature, they don't want to do anything, they don't want to change. It's like a car maker that nobody wants to change. Humans by nature, we like things the way they are. So I think that's an example of where a government can institute a policy that can help having choice. And I agree with Gil, don't say it should be electric's easier or anything, or flex fuels. Let's have as many choices as possible.
And thanks, Governor. That raises an interesting sort of set of questions I want for everybody, which is, there are two ways to think about the policy sphere. And Gil, you mentioned that you've seen leadership here in Israel in creating new opportunities, but then I think there's a lot of, on the flip side, it's what kind of policy obstacles are out there that people maybe you don't know. And that's a really good example of one, Mike. I mean, any others that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it on the vehicle side is highly regulated relative to emissions, relative to anti-tampering regulations on existing vehicles. So just thinking about wanting to have a fuel choice in your existing vehicle is, oftentimes you would be going against what the regulations say you should be doing. So that's another area that has to sort of be broadened and looked at. Maybe from the perspective of a conversion kit that could be certified through EPA to do it. And even on the fuel side, you have regulations that say, a certain fuel, if it's going to be similar to gasoline, then it has to have a whole set of testing to be looked at. So a lot of the low-level blends, you heard some of the E15 discussion this morning, had to have a whole series of tests to make sure that they were compatible within the vehicles. Somewhere might be the case with the higher blends too, although they have been approved as alternative fuels in the past by EPA. And then you have the whole set of equipment suppliers when they supply the equipment. Are they certified to, for example, Underwriters Laboratory standards? Why is that important? Because the fuel station owner has insurance, and if his insurance needs to have a checkoff list that it was using certified equipment. So you have kind of a ripple effect throughout the whole fuel supply chain relative to regulations that could be affected by introducing an alternative fuel into the marketplace.
In Dirk, in Germany, I mean, things that sometimes it's the littlest things that people don't think about, little regulations, little rules. Yeah, again, the example of not being able to, put a new outlet into your house or whatever it is. Any kinds of regulations like that that you've been trying to unearth and overturn or fix as you try to broaden fuel supply choice?
Well, what we have done in Germany is that we did a fuel and mobility strategy where we took care of all the different alternative fuels we have, and that was decided by Chancellor Merkel earlier this year in June. And on the other hand, there's a regulation in Europe on the way which is called Clean Power for Transport, where the European Union takes care of the different infrastructures we need for alternative fuels. And the choice of the European Union, which is under negotiation with the Parliament and the member countries, is that we should concentrate on charging infrastructure for electrical cars, that we should make plans for hydrogen refilling stations for fuel cell cars, that CNG will play a major role in transportation and LNG, especially in the maritime sector. So this would be 4 choices from the European Union for 28 member countries, which is very important because Germany is not an island. So the choices you make in one country should fit to other countries in Europe.
And I didn't hear methanol on that list. And is that because natural gas is not so cheap in Europe? Is it because there's less gasoline-powered cars on the road in Europe? Why is it not one of the sort of top 5 options?
Well, from a German European perspective, methanol would not be the first choice, but it depends on the countries. So the situation in each of the countries is very different. You have that natural gas boom in the US, which is very cheap, and so you can do with LNG, for example. I saw a couple of weeks ago in California that LNG becomes important for trucks.
Yep.
And that's just because of the economics. You pay $4 for a gallon of diesel and $2 for a gallon equivalent of LNG, for example. So from an economical point of view, it makes sense, and all the countries have to make their own choices, what fits to their individual situation.
Let me get at this question about whether or not you can do this really in a sort of cost-free manner. I mean, if you, for instance, mandated that automakers had to make engines that could accept all these variety of fuels, I would assume they push back and say, well, there's a cost to this, and we don't want to be the ones that have to swallow that. So how do you get around that? Tomorrow we're going to hear from someone from BMW, but it would have been useful to have someone from the automakers speaking today, or from one of the major automakers, I should say, speaking today. But have you had that kind of pushback, and what's your
Well, in California, when we first started the methanol program, the agreement with the auto manufacturers was that California would go lobby for CAFE incentives in order to give them the ability to offset some of their cost, the higher cost of the FFEs. And that's exactly what California did, along with others, to lobby Congress to enact the Alternative Motor Fuels Act of 1988, which gave FFEs that CAFE incentive.
So the state of California lobbied to have national fuel economy standards, but how does that get
so what
the
that
automakers on board?
did was help Ford, for example, and General Motors offset the higher cost of the FFEs when they brought them into commercial being in California, all right? And continues to allow the manufacturers to offer FFEs, albeit E85 ethanol FFEs today, into the marketplace without charging the consumer any incremental cost for those vehicles.
How much more would it cost, though, to have that engine be even more flexible so that it could take other kinds of fuels as well?
To be determined. I mean, we believe that there are ways that you could use like a methanol mixture, like an M60 or an M56 mixture, that is close to, on an energy basis, E85, and oh, by the way, on an octane basis and everything else. So So from a combustion point of view, the car would know no difference with that fuel, whether it was methanol or whether it was ethanol. It's transparent. The difference is in the materials. So are there differences on those vehicles that methanol is going to be more corrosive, more interactive with some of those materials compared to ethanol? And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that yet.
Sorry, Governor.
I want to answer the question of what do you do when the oil companies, in this case car companies, what do you do when they push back? And the answer is simple. You exercise political courage. You do what's in the interest of the people you represent. The people you represent would have a cleaner environment. They would have better health. They would have a better economy. They would have greater national security if you mandate flex fuel vehicles. Those are all facts and those are givens. So you stand up and you make the right decision for the people who put you into office. That's really not a very difficult question. The car companies fought seat belts when there was a move to put seat belts and save hundreds of thousands of lives. The car companies fought catalytic converters on cars when you wanted to have a cleaner environment. They still fight the catalytic converters in China, although I was just in China in June and the air was very difficult. I'm just going to say that. And the people there are living in a way that's harming the environment, it's harming their health, their children's health, and yet the car companies fight catalytic converter, which they have to do in our countries. So this is nothing new, it's not unusual, and to let it continue is irresponsible at this point. Knowing everything we know, we need to move forward on this. In addition to that, I'm only speaking for the American government, the American politicians, through their either lack of information or lack of concern, they've misled the American people to believe that if we build windmills and put on solar panels on our homes, then we can solve this issue of energy independence and reliance on foreign oil. And of course, none of that is true.
Except for in Hawaii, right?
Except in Hawaii.
Where you have 90% of your power comes from oil. But
Yes,
everywhere
and
else,
we
you're right.
are taking
In
very
the rest of the U.S.,
aggressive
oil
steps.
represents a very tiny percentage of
Well,
power
and
generation.
I can tell you, Ethan, in Hawaii, and I think Germany is a leader in this field, we have taken some very aggressive policy moves, for instance, to deal with the issue of reliance on oil for electricity, the feed-in tariff issue, which Germany was very successful, which is the government is going to mandate, you're going to publish what you will pay for these renewable energies. We decoupled sales from revenues of the utility company because they had no interest in conservation. They made a living selling kilowatt hours. So we decoupled those two from each other, and that is also making a big difference. So there's policy things you can do legislatively, but also administratively through the Utilities Commission.
Go ahead, Mike.
Just to comment on your comment, Linda, I don't want to be, as an alternative fuel advocate, I don't necessarily want to defend the auto companies, but $100 on $16 million sales per year is a lot of money. Now,
Sorry, I don't
Now-
understand. $100 on 16,
16 million,
Ethan, it only costs
Six-
$100 to
six-
retrofit a car.
right.
but you
Okay.
have 16 million cars that are sold in the United States.
Right.
All right? So that's the total cost of doing that. Now, there isn't a fuel out there that's competitive in the marketplace to even use it in the FFEs today. Ethanol is not, is generally priced on a volume basis because of the low-level blend market. Nobody wants to sell it on an energy basis into the higher-level blend market. So if you go to an E85 station, occasionally you will find it priced on an energy basis where it would make sense to use it in your car. Most of the time, it's not. It costs you more. Why did the auto companies have to subsidize that cost when there's not even a fuel out there to use it?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, go ahead. I have an
So-
answer, but go you please.
So the automobile manufacturers, when they added seat belts to cars, it cost more. They didn't absorb that. They passed that on to the consumer. In this case, the consumer, if they were knowledgeable about how much they could potentially save over the long term, they're going to want to do this. Also, it's not just the new manufacturers, but as we said, it's the kits. It's being able to retrofit your car, but because of government regulation, even though it would be safe to do so, people are not allowed to go forward. I think in Germany's case, I'm fascinated with Germany's approach on this issue. You talked about the integration of electricity and transportation, which makes a tremendous amount of sense to me, and I heard your comment about it being difficult. But if you think about it, when you have to recharge, thinking of my electric vehicle, you have to recharge your vehicle, you usually do it at night. Usually, you come home, you plug in, and that's usually when the electric plant is at its lowest usage. And so that really helps you because these plants are usually built for these peaks, right? So now you're able to equalize that. So there's a lot of synergy between those two things. But this is because Germany has collectively, globally, nationally made a decision. We want to become users of clean energy, or we want energy independence, whatever their decisions were. We need to have that same kind of focus in our country and be clear with consumers, not put out information that if we build windmills and put solar panels on it, when we're already energy independent for electricity. So the average American, I think, really needs to be talked with in a more educated way. And I don't know if the politicians don't know it or they just don't want to do it.
I think a point very well taken. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions in the U.S. About the energy is just one great big pile, and oil is in there, and that represents how we power our houses, which, like I said earlier, is really not the case in most cases. Gil, I know you've been patient. You wanted to add a comment earlier.
To begin with, it's not necessarily more expensive. In the case of M15, the difficulty is that the automakers will announce, and it's written in manual book, that you cannot use methanol. And that's an issue because then the driver will be scared that his warranty will no longer be there. So it's not necessarily a matter of cost. Yet, let's analyze it. It's rather simple. We have 5 major oil companies, we have 5 major automobile producers, and we have 2 billion consumers. And in the middle, we have the regulators, the politicians. And who do they represent? What happened in Israel now is that actually this initiative is representing the good wealth of the consumers. Maybe the driving before this is not necessarily the consumers, but the bottom line is that the consumers will pay less. They will pay less because they'll have a wider choice. And that gives the answer to your question. If we take the hybrid car, in Israel, a hybrid car, the same model will cost much more. Yet, I think you see hybrid cars in Israel because government has also provided positive incentives to whoever is driving hybrid car, as well as there is some consumer responsibility. So we have to work on it together, and we must remember those 2 billion consumers who are our partners, and then they will eventually dictate to the automobile producers and to whoever what they want, as long as they know that this choice exists.
Dirk, I want to come back to you for just one moment because Germany is such an interesting example. To some degree, you're the envy of the world in terms of the amount of renewable capacity that you've brought online. On the other hand, there's the massive volume, for instance, of photovoltaics has at times caused problems within the grid in terms of the variability of that as a source. If you could, to what the Governor Lingle was talking about earlier, talk a little bit about how you're trying to integrate these two things, because I think it is an interesting challenge. And to some degree, in this challenge, as in a number of others, Germany is 3 steps ahead of the rest of us, right? So Germany has gone out and now added a meaningful amount of renewable capacity that has created these challenges. That's not something that most other countries have yet, but do aspire to get to at some point.
Well, we have a clear policy. I will give you one example. When we have in Germany a windy and sunny day, we have a surplus of renewable energies because we already have a share of 30% of renewable energies in the grid. So on a windy and sunny day, what are we doing with the surplus? For the moment, we have some friends in Austria. They have hydro pump stations, so they can use that and making money by taking the additional electricity from the German grid and sell that back in the next morning as peak hour electric energy. So it's a good business for them. But the core question is how to store renewable energies. And we have some interesting projects in Germany where you can see, for example, that hydrogen is an interesting storage. So you use an electrolyzer and the renewable energies are used in that days where it's very windy and sunny in Germany to fill up a hydrogen filling station as a storage. So if you have once stored the hydrogen, you can use that in three ways. The one is you can use that for re-electrification during peak times. Then you can put that in the natural gas grid up to 5%, so it can be used for heating houses and so on. That's also a huge storage in Germany, the natural gas grid. And if you have once stored the hydrogen, you can of course use them in the transportation sector. That's what we are doing. And there is still a small gap until that's really working on an economical level. But we think that storing renewable energies will become a much more important topic in the future. And then the core question is how to combine these things. Then you have the transportation sector, which needs energy, electrical energy, and you have the grid and the utilities who have to take care of the renewable energies. And if you combine these things, if you don't see that as separated systems, and if you integrate that, that might become interesting. And for example, we are working very tough on hydrogen. We already have 15 stations in Germany which are public accessible, and we financed another 35. So in 2 years we will have 50 stations and the first initial network. And recently, 4 weeks ago, industry announced that they will build another 350, so that we will have in 10 years 400 hydrogen filling stations. And we know that the car makers are working on the topic. Toyota will bring fuel cell cars in 2015. We know that Daimler will bring fuel cell cars in 2017, and we know that other German car makers are working very seriously on the topic of fuel cells and hydrogen.
So just to be clear, who is paying for those stations? Because that's one of the, I mean, clearly energy storage is one of the real holy grails that still needs to be solved for this whole energy puzzle. And yet one of the questions is how do you roll out this technology? How do you scale it up? So who is underwriting those? Who underwrote the first 50 and who's going to underwrite the next 350?
The first 50 are paid with some subsidies by the government, because we do that as a demonstration project within our program on hydrogen, which is called National Innovation Program. And the amount is relatively small, so we are talking about 50 million euros for 50 stations. That is what we give as a government, and we expect industry to pay half of the invest and so on. And the next step between the 50 and 400, so that's mostly paid by industry, and we have to discuss what government can do on the regulation side and giving some guarantees, some kind of that, but that will not be paid by the government. And then let's see what will happen on the utility side and on the grid side, and how the topic of storing electrical energy becomes more and more important for the whole sector. And then we combine transport sector and the utilities and the grid.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're just about out of time, unless we have, I don't know if we have time for one quick one from the audience. If not,
I don't think we've got any particular ones. There was one actually for Gil regarding the gas, and someone asking the question I'm not quite sure if I follow it, about subsidized gas prices, but presumably Israel's gas boom is, I mean, this is great for you, right? I mean, you couldn't possibly have dreamed of anything better. Is that fair to say right now?
Sure, we will.
I mean, for your business in particular, I mean,
but it took him so many years, and here we are.
that was amazing. 2 years ago, this was coming, and now it's arrived, and it's changed things.
Tamara's
so
arrived recently. Before there were smaller drillings. And this, by the way, is an initiative which was done by the private sector, and it took many, many years because the gas in Israel is very deep in the sea. But it's a great news for Israel, and I hope we are clever enough to sell it not as raw material, but rather as an added value product.
Such as chemicals.
It can be chemicals, plastic industry, you name it. It's a huge opportunity, which, by the way, will, I think that from the Israeli point of view, it can lead for unlimited new ideas, new technologies, which I'm proud to be part of this society, which is very innovative.
Thank you for that last comment. I mean, it's an interesting parallel between Israel and the U.S., where we've had this bounty of natural gas, and is suddenly making manufacturing much more competitive in the U.S., and is also raising real debates about how much of it we should export, which I know is a relevant question here in Israel as well. So thank you so much to this terrific panel. This is the last one of the day, and so I'll hand it back to Elliot, but just if you would join me in thanking this panel for their interesting comments.